136,000 young people became homeless across the UK last year, yet this issue gets no political attention. Please, can you talk about the New Horizon Youth Centres campaign to call on the government to create a national strategy to end youth homelessness? Big, quick shout out here, firstly for Jon Snow, who's done amazing things in his life, and this is one of the many, many great things he's done.
Is that, as it were, the Jon Snow?
This is the Jon Snow, the Channel 4 news presenter with the extraordinary coloured ties,
Yep.
the Vietnam War reporter and the rest of it. There's a petition actually at the moment on the government website of trying to get the government to focus on homelessness. A shout out also to Andy Burnham. I was really impressed with the steps that he took as Mayor of Greater Manchester, particularly kind of 2019, 2020, to address homelessness in Greater Manchester. But any thoughts on this from you?
I spoke a few weeks ago at a big housing conference where the last housing minister, not the current one, but the one before, was also present. And I think I'm right in saying that we've now had 16 housing ministers since David Cameron became Prime Minister. Now, that says to me it is not a priority within government. I think the problem with our housing debate is that it's been, you talked earlier about Margaret Thatcher and her continuing influence. I think our debate about housing is still influenced by these twin poles of a very old-fashioned view of what social housing means, council housing,
Yeah.
and the fact that Margaret Thatcher, and it was politically successful for a time, sold off lots of allowed for council houses to be bought by their tenants. And on the other side, the sort of obsession with, if you like, the unearned income of rising house prices, particularly in the southeast. And within that, there's this sort of vast issue called housing, which is about where people live and how people live. That the questioner is right, that doesn't get the political attention that it deserves. Now, I was pleased to see Angela Rayner this week made a intervention about housing. One of Labour's big growth missions is about changing the planning system because we have to build more homes and so forth. But the fact is that when we have targeted people without a home, including the extremes, if you remember during COVID, literally the government said we've got to get people off the streets and into a safe accommodation every night. They managed to do it. So I do think it's one of those issues where, yes, we need brilliant initiatives like the one that John's talking about, but this will only work for the country as a whole if there is strategic leadership from the government that says housing finally is going to be a priority for the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Conservative story inside government was a bit more complicated because it's not just about those 16 ministers. I remember every year that I was in Parliament that housing was seen as the number one priority. And it's partly because the polls were pretty consistent, that it was the thing that really alienated people, that it was the fundamental injustice. The biggest inequality in our society is not between the top 1% and the bottom 99. It's between the 60% who own houses and the 40% who don't. And so it was talked about all the time. Oliver Letwin, who was Cameron's kind of resident policy thinker and intellectual, was put in charge of task forces on that. They brought in ministers who were meant to be high flyers. Dominic Raab, Kit Malthouse were brought in to do housing. Gavin Barwell did housing, who I was praising just in the Croydon question. So there were some pretty talented people brought in sometimes to do it, and Number 10 talked about it a lot. But in the end, nothing happened. And it just got stuck in a morass of complaints about developers' land banking and about planning regulations and he said and she said and whatnot. I think the problem that I decided when I was running for London Mayor was that the problem was that actually the government should just build it itself. That the problem was we were relying on the market. And actually, I would have liked to see the Mayor of London say, look, I've got thousands of acres of Transport for London and Mayor of London land. I'm going to borrow money on the bond markets and I'm going to set it off building high quality council housing in London against that money and bring the interest in on the rent. And I think that's the way to crack it if Labour's prepared to actually just build the housing rather than trying to tinker around on creating incentives for markets.